Mark Rivers could feel it in his bones. Something had changed. For the past few weeks, Kira had been different, leaving the house more often, staying late at work, keeping her phone face down on the table. At first, he ignored it, dismissing the unsettling feeling as paranoia. After all, she was his wife. He had trusted her for years. But trust had a way of turning into blindness. And now, as he sat alone in their dimly lit living room, staring at the flickering security footage on his laptop screen, his hands clenched into fists. The hidden camera had been a desperate move, one he never thought he'd make. But something about Kira's recent behavior had gnawed at him, whispering in his ear late at night when she wasn't beside him in bed. The late-night texts, the hushed phone calls, the sudden change in perfume. He couldn't ignore the signs anymore. So, he installed the camera in their bedroom, hidden within the sleek digital clock on the nightstand. And now, here he was, watching the footage play out like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. At first, it seemed harmless. Kira entering the bedroom, looking at herself in the mirror, fixing her hair. But then, the door opened again, and in walked a man. Tall, confident, expensively dressed. David Hall. Mark's pulse hammered against his skull. He knew that name. Kira had mentioned him once, in passing, a business associate. Someone she worked with. Now he watched as David placed a hand on Kira's waist. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into him, her fingers grazing his chest. Mark's breath turned shallow. Then came the moment that sent a surge of cold fury through his veins. Kira whispered something too soft for the camera's microphone to pick up. And David laughed. Then he kissed her. And she kissed him back. The screen blurred as Mark's vision darkened with rage. His mind swirled with memories of their life together, the years of devotion, the quiet mornings over coffee, the whispered promises of forever. All of it, reduced to nothing. He exhaled slowly, forcing his heartbeat to steady. His anger wasn't the kind that burned out in an instant. No, it was something else entirely. Cold, calculated, dangerous. If she had simply betrayed him, he might have walked away. But what he uncovered next changed everything. As the footage continued, Kira and David's conversation became clearer. She wasn't just cheating, she was planning something. Something that involved him. Something that could destroy him. Mark leaned back in his chair, his lips curling into a slow, humorless smile. She thought she had everything under control. She had no idea what was coming. Mark Rivers had always been a man of logic. Cold, precise, methodical. That's what made him successful in his field. He analyzed risks, formulated strategies, and always stayed 3 steps ahead. But now, his life wasn't just business. It was personal. The revelation from the hidden camera was a wound that hadn't stopped bleeding, but Mark wasn't a man to let emotions cloud his actions. Fury had settled into something far more potent: control. If Kira and David wanted to play a game, they had no idea they had just invited a grandmaster to the table. He spent the next night going through every second of footage, dissecting their movements, their words, their body language. He noted how Kira's touch lingered on David's arm, how David smirked as if he had already won, the arrogance, the sheer audacity of it. But it wasn't just the affair. In another recording, this one captured from a microphone he had hidden in her closet, Mark heard them discussing something that made his blood turn to ice. "We just need him out of the way," Kira had whispered. "And you're sure the money is secure?" David's voice was smooth, but there was an edge to it. Impatience, maybe even greed. "Once Mark is gone, it all transfers to me. Legally, he won't have a leg to stand on. The lawyers will eat him alive." He's too blind to see what's coming. A slow, eerie calm settled over Mark. He had suspected infidelity, but this was betrayal on a whole new level. They weren't just cheating on him, they were planning to ruin him. Mark had built his empire from nothing. Every dollar in their joint accounts, every investment, every property, they were all the result of his discipline and sacrifice. And now, Kira wanted to strip it all away, hand it over to her lover, and walk away with a smile. No, that wasn't going to happen. Laying the trap. Mark didn't confront Kira, not yet. That would have been too easy, too predictable. Instead, he played his part flawlessly, acting as if nothing had changed. The next morning, he kissed her cheek as she left for work. He smiled at her across the dinner table that evening. He listened to her stories about her long meetings and nodded at the right moments. And all the while, he worked in the shadows. His first move was securing his assets. Every shared account was quietly emptied. He transferred his funds to offshore accounts, locked his investments under his sole control, and revoked Kira's access to everything she thought she owned. Then he started planting seeds of doubt between Kira and David. He made sure David's wife received an anonymous email containing just enough evidence to rattle her, but not enough to fully expose the affair, just enough to make David paranoid. Mark watched with satisfaction as small cracks began to form. Kira's phone calls became more frantic. David stopped showing up at their usual meeting places. The tension between them grew, shifting from passion to uncertainty. And then the final piece of the puzzle, the illusion of Mark's downfall. He fabricated emails and fake financial reports showing that his business was in serious trouble. He staged a meeting with his accountant, ensuring Kira accidentally overheard snippets of a conversation that suggested bankruptcy. That same evening, she sat beside him on the couch, her fingers drumming against her wine glass. "Rough day?" she asked, her voice too casual. "You could say that," Mark sighed, rubbing his temples. "We might have to make some sacrifices. Things are tight." He saw the flicker of hesitation in her eyes. He knew exactly what she was thinking. Kira didn't love him, she loved his money, and if that was about to disappear, so was she. Mark leaned back, swirling the whiskey in his glass. He wasn't just going to expose her, he was going to make her destroy herself. Mark Rivers had never enjoyed gambling, but this was different. This wasn't about luck or risk. It was about strategy. A chess match where Kira and David believed they were winning, unaware that every move they made was leading them straight into a trap. After weeks of silent observation, he had gathered everything he needed: bank records, private messages, and video evidence, but it wasn't enough to destroy them. He needed them to destroy each other. That process had already begun, turning David against Kira. Mark knew that David was a creature of ambition. He wasn't with Kira out of love. He wanted power, influence, money. But Mark had seen the slight hesitation in David's voice during their recorded conversations. David might have been playing Kira, but he was just as capable of cutting her loose the moment she became a liability. It was time to push that wedge even deeper. Through a carefully crafted network of anonymous emails, Mark fed David's growing paranoia. One email hinted at Kira moving funds into an undisclosed account, implying she was planning to run off without him. Another contained a blurred, altered screenshot of Kira texting an unknown contact, accompanied by a message, "Are you sure you're the only one?" The final email, sent at just the right moment, was a simple question: how much do you really know about her? The results were almost immediate. Mark noticed the subtle change in Kira's routine. She called David more often, her voice sharper, more desperate. She checked her phone constantly, frowning at messages she wasn't receiving. And then came the arguments. Mark had planned it perfectly, a meeting at an upscale restaurant where Kira and David would be sure to be seen. He had someone plant David's wife there right at the moment David's patience snapped. Mark wasn't there in person, but he had the security footage. David slammed his hand on the table, his face a mix of anger and uncertainty. Kira leaned forward, whispering harshly, but David pulled back. Then David's wife arrived. The slap she delivered echoed across the restaurant. Kira sat frozen, her eyes darting between David and his wife as a scene unfolded around them. People stared. Whispers spread. Mark smiled as he watched it all unfold. David was unraveling, and Kira was losing control, setting the financial trap. With David distracted, Mark moved on to Kira's greatest weakness: money. The financial decline he had staged was working. Kira had started making her own moves, transferring small amounts of money into separate accounts. She was planning her exit, but Mark had anticipated this. Before she could access those funds, he had them locked. She tried to log into her banking app that evening. Mark was in his study when he heard her sharp intake of breath from the next room. What the hell? She tried again. A third time, her breathing quickened. Then she called the bank. Mark listened as she argued with the representative, her frustration turning into panic. "There has to be a mistake. Those are my accounts." Silence. "No, I don't understand. I need that money now." Another pause. "My husband did what?" That was his cue. Mark walked into the room, the perfect image of concern. He had been waiting for this moment. Something wrong, darling? He asked, his voice dripping with feigned innocence. Kira spun to face him, her phone still clutched in her hand. For the first time, Mark saw something in her eyes he hadn't seen before. You froze my accounts? She spat. Mark raised an eyebrow. Our accounts. And yes, I did. Her lips parted, but no words came. I spoke to my lawyer this morning, he continued, stepping closer. You see, Kira, I started noticing something strange. Transactions I didn't authorize. Money disappearing. Naturally, I had to protect myself. She clenched her fists. You can't do this to me. Mark leaned in, his voice lowering to a whisper. I already did. She was trapped, and she knew it. The breaking point. The next few days were chaos. Kira tried everything, pleading, screaming, even threatening legal action, but it was too late. David was avoiding her. Her accounts were locked. She had no financial safety net. Then came the final blow. Mark made sure that Kira's employer received an anonymous package containing a carefully compiled dossier of her activities, the affair, the embezzlement, her plan to manipulate corporate assets. Within hours, she was called into an emergency meeting, and by the time she walked out, her career was over. She came home that night in a daze, her movements robotic. Mark sat in his chair, sipping whiskey as she entered. They fired me, she whispered. He nodded. I know. She looked up at him, her once confident gaze shattered. She wasn't just losing a marriage anymore, she was losing everything. Mark, please. He watched her, expression unreadable. You did this, she whispered. Mark set his glass down, standing to his full height. For the first time in their marriage, Kira truly saw him, not as the man she had manipulated, but as the one she had underestimated. No, Kira, he said, his voice calm but final. You did this to yourself. Kira Rivers was suffocating. She had spent her life mastering control, manipulating situations, bending people to her will with a careful mix of charm and deception. But now, that power was slipping through her fingers like sand in a storm. Everything was crumbling. David had abandoned her. The last time she had called him, he had picked up just long enough to tell her, don't contact me again. Then silence. Her accounts were frozen. She had no access to money, no emergency funds, nothing but the dwindling cash in her purse. She had spent years carefully positioning herself to be untouchable, yet now she was backed into a corner, stripped of every advantage she once had. And worst of all, Mark knew everything. She had seen it in his eyes the night she came home after being fired. The cold satisfaction, the way he leaned back in his chair watching her like a predator observing its prey. She had lost. Or had she? Desperation breeds recklessness. Kira refused to go down without a fight. Mark might have outmaneuvered her financially, but she still had one card left to play. The house. The sprawling modern home they had built together was still legally half hers, and if Mark thought he could simply push her out, he was mistaken. She needed leverage. She spent hours on the phone the next morning, trying to find a lawyer willing to take her case. But the responses were all the same. Mrs. Rivers, your husband has already filed a claim contesting joint ownership due to fraudulent financial activity on your part. Given the evidence, you may not have a claim at all. Fraudulent financial activity? Kira nearly threw her phone against the wall. That bastard had planned everything. He had moved faster than she expected, locking her out before she even realized the walls were closing in. Her only option now was Mark himself, a dangerous proposition. That night, Kira decided to shift tactics. If brute force wouldn't work, she would try something else. Seduction. Mark was a man of logic, but he was still a man. She knew every weakness he had, every button to push. He had loved her once. Perhaps some part of him still did. She dressed carefully, choosing the silk robe he used to love, letting her hair fall in soft waves. When he came home, she was waiting for him in the dimly lit living room, curled up on the couch with a glass of wine. Mark, she said softly, standing as he entered. Can we talk? His expression was unreadable as he set down his briefcase. Talk, he repeated, as if the word was foreign to him. She walked toward him, placing a hand lightly on his arm. She made sure to look vulnerable, exhausted, fragile. I know things have been bad between us, she whispered. But we don't have to end like this. We can fix things. I made mistakes, yes, but you... She let her voice break slightly. You made mistakes too. For a moment, Mark said nothing. His eyes flickered to her hand on his arm, then back to her face. Then he laughed. Not a short chuckle, a full, rich, amused laugh. Kira's breath hitched. You really think that's going to work? Mark asked, shaking his head. I don't. Save it, Kira. His voice was ice now. You're not here to fix anything. You're here because you're out of options. You're desperate, and you think I'll fall for it. He stepped closer, forcing her to take a step back. I want you to understand something, he continued, his voice low. This isn't just about revenge anymore. This is about consequences. Something you've never had to face. Kira swallowed hard. This was a different Mark, not the passive, controlled man she had spent years molding. This Mark was something else entirely. I still own half this house, she said, forcing herself to sound confident. Not for long, Mark replied. Your name is already being removed. The paperwork is in motion. Her stomach dropped. You can't do that. I already did. A door closing. Kira didn't sleep that night. She paced the bedroom, her mind racing. If Mark had already moved to strip her of her claim to the house, she had almost nothing left. Almost. She still had one final move. It was risky, dangerous. But if she didn't act now, she would lose everything. At 3 a.m., she pulled out her phone and made a call. The man who answered spoke in a low, gruff voice. Kiara, didn't expect to hear from you. I need your help. A pause. In trouble? She hesitated. Then, not yet, but I will be soon. Silence. Then, meet me tomorrow. Usual place. She ended the call, her heart hammering. If Mark wanted consequences, he was about to get them. But this time, she wouldn't be the one who lost. Mark Rivers had expected desperation. He had seen it in Kira's eyes, the way she grasped at every crumbling piece of her life, trying to hold on to the illusion of control. But he also knew something else. Desperate people make reckless choices. That's why when she left the house the next morning, he followed her. Mark had planned for every contingency, legal action, financial ruin, even the possibility of her attempting to manipulate him emotionally. But he wasn't naive enough to believe that Kira would go down without one final play. And now, as he watched from a safe distance, sitting in his car across the street from a shady-looking cafe, he realized she had just made her last mistake. She wasn't meeting a lawyer. She wasn't seeking a settlement. She was meeting someone dangerous. A deal with the devil. From his vantage point, Mark could see Kira sitting in the corner booth of the cafe, nervously stirring her coffee. The man across from her was rough, unshaven, with the kind of cold eyes that spoke of a life lived outside the law. Mark had dealt with men like this before in business, people who thrived in the shadows, feeding off the desperation of others. Kira was playing with fire, and she didn't even realize that Mark was already holding the extinguisher. With careful patience, he pulled out his phone and took a series of photos. Kira leaning in, the man nodding, a small flash of something being exchanged beneath the table. A thick envelope. Mark exhaled slowly. She was trying to hire someone. But for what? To hurt him? To dig up dirt on him? It didn't matter. Because whatever she was planning, it was already over. The trap closes. By the time Kira returned home that evening, Mark had already set everything in motion. She walked in, her face carefully neutral, but Mark could see the tension in her shoulders, the stiffness in her steps. Long day? He asked casually, sipping his whiskey from the leather chair by the fireplace. You could say that, she replied, her voice smooth but forced. Mark nodded. Then he picked up his phone and pressed play. The cafe meeting unfolded on the screen in crisp, clear video. The audio, captured from a microphone he had discreetly planted in her car days ago, was unmistakable. I need him gone, Kira's voice said softly in the recording. Define gone, the man responded. A long pause. Then, make it look like an accident. Kira's breath hitched as she stood frozen, staring at the screen. Mark took another sip of whiskey before setting the glass down. You didn't really think I wouldn't see this coming, did you? He asked, tilting his head slightly. She turned to him, her expression shifting between shock and fury. Her world was caving in. You set me up, she hissed. No, Kira, Mark said, standing slowly. I just let you destroy yourself. The police arrived 15 minutes later. By the time Kira realized what was happening, the officers were already inside, the arrest warrant in hand. Kira Rivers, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder. She turned to Mark, eyes wild. Mark me, please, you can't. I'm not doing anything, he interrupted, his voice cold. These are just the consequences you tried so hard to avoid. As they pulled her away, Mark watched with detached calmness. For the first time in months, he felt at peace. Kira thought she had been playing a game, but in reality, she had just been another piece on the board. And Mark had already checkmated her before the game had even begun.